This is episode 117 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico podcast. I'm Paul Gessing. I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. This and every week we'll be talking to you about public policy issues facing New Mexico. This week I am pleased to be joined by Rachel Greszler. She is a research fellow in the Grover M. Herman Center for the Federal Budget at the Heritage Foundation, a think tank based in Washington, D.C. Rachel speaks and writes on issues relating to entitlements and Social Security, a variety of issues, including labor policies. We're going to have a lot to talk about today, but welcome to Tipping Point, New Mexico, Rachel.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and before we got on the air, we were talking a little bit about time I spent in Washington, D.C., and working with the Heritage Foundation on some of these same issues. And since it's been about 13 years since I've been in Washington, D.C., I'm sure we've solved all the issues I was dealing with, like entitlement spending and taxes and minimum wages. We know those aren't a good idea, right? We're all moving on to bigger and better problems.
Unfortunately not. It's the same old problems, just growing bigger, though.
Exactly. And, we've got a number of different things we want to talk about today, but you wrote an article about the CBO study that came out on the $15 an hour minimum wage. And, boy, it seems like this minimum wage discussion just keeps getting more and more out there. I know a member of the squad, the little congressional clique there, has introduced, or is discussing at least, a $20 minimum wage. But before we get all the way down the path to $20 an hour, let's talk a little bit about $15 minimum wage. Considering we're at $7.25 right now, what is the CBO saying? What are you saying about the minimum wage increase to $15 an hour?
Well, this is a huge increase. As you said, $7.25 to $15 an hour. That's a 107% increase. And so if we want to drill down and say, well, how is this going to affect the economy? First, how is it going to affect employers and workers? I think those of us who just are living our ordinary lives, what if our biggest expense, our mortgage or our rent, were to more than double tomorrow? The consequences of that are significant. You would have to cut back on all types of spending. You may have to look to moving to a smaller home. Some people might not be able to find a home, period. And it's the same case when we look at a $15 minimum wage. That jump is so big, and you're simply pricing some people out of the market. And that's exactly what the CBO report found, is that, even in their median estimate, there would be 1.3 million jobs lost, but it could be 3.7 million or more. And the reason for that is that a $15 minimum wage for an employer is equivalent to about $38,000 in costs per year. And not every individual in the economy can produce $38,000, particularly if we're looking at younger individuals, maybe teenagers who are saving for college, somebody who has a disability, somebody who's just getting out of prison, may not speak English, doesn't have a college education. There are all sorts of reasons why individuals can't produce that much, particularly in the early years of their labor force participation. But if we set the minimum wage at that, you just cut off all those jobs completely, and they're not going to come back, and there's nowhere else for those individuals to go to find employment.
Yeah, it's a very aggressive move, and I don't know if you've looked at or can speak to the impacts of, say, a minimum wage increase on a high cost of living area, whether it's Washington, D.C., where you live now, or according to your bio, you're from, I believe, upstate New York. And, New Mexico is a lot more on the low income side of things. And you wonder in some of these states why New York City is making policies, or the policies are driven by New York City. Same thing with California, where you have L.A. and San Francisco setting wage policies that are also applicable in Fresno and Bakersfield. So can you talk about that a little bit?
I'm glad you brought up that point, because what we're talking about here is a federal minimum wage, one that is exactly the same across the whole U.S., a one-size-fits-all policy, when really we have very unique labor markets, very unique economic conditions across the U.S., across the 50 states and D.C., but also even within a state. And so it's one thing if New York City or Seattle or L.A. or D.C. wants to impose a $15 minimum wage on its businesses and on its people. That's going to have a different impact than if you impose that in Little Rock, Arkansas, or Mobile, Alabama. You know, where I grew up, as you said, Western New York State is so different from New York City. You know, I grew up with 50 acres of land and a barn, and it's very different, and it's a lower income area. And I'm sure, I would actually like to do an economic study on this, but I'm sure that they are going to be really hard hit by a $15 minimum wage. You know, my friends and I in high school would work at fast food restaurants or at small family businesses, and they're not going to be able, a lot of them won't stay in business, and others will have to significantly change their structure, you know, drastically increasing prices, cutting back on the amount they produce in order to just stay in business. And we've seen, there's a website called Faces of 15, and it documents how all these restaurants and smaller family businesses have had to either shut their doors or significantly cut back on staff and hours, and just the negative consequences that have come from something that people think of as a good thing. We all want individuals to have higher wages, and we want them to have a wage that they can live on somewhat comfortably, but we don't want to knock people out of the labor force entirely. And so I think what Congress should be doing here is just letting the states set their own minimum wages, letting local areas set their own minimum wages. And that's not to say there won't be consequences from that. We've seen even in places like Seattle that they've had consequences. They've had their employers are keeping kind of the best and the brightest of the lower wage workers, those who have the most experience, and they're cutting back the hours and taking away the jobs of those who have less experience. And it's one thing when Seattle does that, and the economic literature shows that what the workers who've had fewer jobs and fewer hours have gone outside the city now to find additional work at lower wages. But when you implement something across the whole U.S., workers can't go outside the U.S. very easily to find a job at a lower wage to give them that kind of first stepping stone and the opportunities to eventually earn a higher wage over time. So it's a really problematic issue that we're talking about here on the federal level. And you talk about raising it higher and higher, $20 per hour, maybe that's 10 to 15 million jobs that are lost.
Yeah. Now, kind of taking the devil's advocate side here, the CBO, and you might be able to discuss some of the limitations in the way CBO approaches issues. Congressional Budget Office, for those who don't know what the CBO is, they did the study that was released here at the beginning of July about a $15 an hour minimum wage. But they did also say or claim that that there would be 1.3 million families lifted out of poverty by increasing the minimum wage to $15 an hour. And I think this is something that a lot of free marketeers like us might be skeptical of. But can you talk to or respond to that argument that that raising the minimum wage would have that positive impact in any way, shape, or form?
Absolutely. We can't deny that there are going to be people who will benefit from having their wage go from whether it's $7.25 an hour to $15 an hour, $12 to $15, whatever it is. There will be some real gains for the people who keep their jobs and keep their hours. Those gains will be biggest in the short term when employers haven't quite adjusted and they're just having to pay the higher wage, and they haven't taken into account reducing the hours, raising the prices, reducing the amount that they invest in, all these types of things that change over time. So we're talking about, yes, there will be winners, but there's also the losers. And so Congress's role should not be to step in and pick who's going to win by how much and who's going to lose and by how much. And I think you need to look there at there will be some income gains, but what about the people who have lost their job entirely? And it's not just like, oh, you're going to get by on $20 less per week or something. It's that you have no job and you have no prospects going forward because those jobs have been wiped out. And this is serious consequences for these individuals. These are people who have the least skill, the least experience, and you're talking about no more job. That's going to lead to things like homelessness and all other sorts of problems that then the government is going to have to step in and decide how are we going to deal with these people that have no jobs anymore, no homes to live in. So it's just going to, picking the winners and losers is not something that we should be doing. We should be looking for ways that we can increase opportunities for everybody. And something that already is in federal policy is the earned income tax credit. So for anybody who has a child or is supporting a family, the minimum wage is already not $7.25 an hour. It's between about $10 and $11 per hour. And so that's one way that we're getting at these workers. But the consequences are also not just, yes, some people have more income, some people have lower incomes or no incomes, but everybody across the board is also going to see the result of higher prices for things. I had a colleague at the Heritage Foundation that estimated fast food prices alone would rise by between 25 and 40% when you increase the minimum wage to $15 per hour. And those prices continue to creep up over time. You're going to have less investment. And so people are going to become less productive because they don't have the tools that are helping them to, gain that productivity over time. And these things compound. So in the beginning, what that CBO report shows is that, yes, there's higher incomes, but as the businesses really adjust and have to raise their prices and reduce their investment, and some of them shut down, 10 years out from now, average family incomes are actually $9 billion lower as a whole than they are today. So in whole, we are worse off because of this. Yes, there are going to be some people who win and there are going to be people who lose, but it's not good for the economy either.
Yeah, and that's something that I think is underreported, is that the overall economy would shrink based on the $15 minimum wage. That's not good. It shows that a policy is ultimately hitting and hurting the overall economy. And kind of getting beyond minimum wage, we could certainly talk back and forth about all the various issues. But given the politics in Washington, put on your pundit hat, with the House controlled by Democrats and so much hinging on, for them, seemingly maintaining your progressive street cred. Do you think that if we magically wound up with a Democrat Senate and a Democrat in the White House, that they would really go for a $15 minimum wage per hour, or do you think they would? This is just a political ploy at this point, kind of making a statement?
That's an interesting question, because I think that right now it's definitely just popular to say I'm for a $15 minimum wage. But what if they're all, as you said, the administration, the House, and the Senate were all in Democrats' control? Could they really walk back on what they've talked about all this time? And, Democratic economists, those who worked for the Obama administration, cautioned against a $15 per hour minimum wage. They said it's not a risk worth taking. They pointed out the fact that it's going to reduce opportunities and hurt the least advantaged. So, I think they would continue to push for it. You might see some changes to the legislation to maybe exempt certain ages of workers, teenagers, or certain groups, or create a sub-minimum wage in certain parts of the country. But I think it would be hard for them to back off completely of this thing that they have been so supportive of.
Yeah, and do you think minimum wages should exist at all? And if so, where should minimum wage policies be made? Do you think federal government, state, local, is there a right way to make what I think we might agree is bad economic policy, or where should these policies come from? Because it seems like everybody wants to get the mix. In New Mexico, we have a city, Santa Fe, with I think it's over $11 minimum wage, and then we've got the state with their own minimum wage increase, and now we've got the federal government. It just seems like a real mess when it comes to compliance and making the policies in the first place.
Yeah, I think if you're going to have a minimum wage, then it should be decided at the local level, because even at the state level, the states are just so diverse that it doesn't make sense to have one across the entire area. For example, in New York, like I said. But do we really need a minimum wage period? I think there was a time when we needed it. There was a time when we didn't have significant labor protections. But in this day and age, I feel that we don't even need a minimum wage, because workers and employers are free to engage in mutually beneficial contracts. There are times when, an internship or something, a $0 wage is actually still beneficial for both the worker and the employer. And if that's something that the individual wants to do, that opportunity should be there for them. And so I think that we should be letting the free market decide what the wage is. And in this economy, particularly today, where there are so many more job openings than there are workers looking for jobs, and businesses' biggest hurdle is finding good workers, I think that we're in a great place for individuals to be able to find jobs and to be able to negotiate for the wages that reflect their worth.
Yeah, no doubt. And certainly, I'm sure your personal experience, having grown up in upstate New York and seeing New York policymakers really control things, must have had at least some impact on you and your family there. And watching that, I can only imagine what that was like.
Yeah, it definitely did. You grew up in a small rural area, and yet you are subject to the laws that are largely written in this big metropolitan area, and you see the consequences of that. And I certainly saw people choose to locate, 5 miles away in the Pennsylvania area because of the high taxes and the level of government regulation and intervention that was placed on people just because you're living in New York versus another state.
Well, let's shift the discussion to Social Security in particular, and I'm talking to Rachel Greszler. She is at the Heritage Foundation, an analyst on all manner of budget and tax issues. And Social Security, all we get these days seemingly are either proposals to increase the Social Security system to make it bigger. We get reports talking about the dire financial condition of Social Security and other federal entitlement programs. But I'm going to start off with, kind of a point that I like to make on Social Security is that the crappy rate of return. I know that's the economics term is crappy, but I'm 44 years old. I'll let the cat out of the bag, and I'll say that if I could invest my Social Security dollars moving forward for the rest of my professional career, I would gladly turn over everything that I paid into the Social Security system from the earliest days of my working back to 16 years old or something. Am I wrong in doing that? And talk a little bit about why workers really aren't getting a great deal out of Social Security more generally.
Certainly. And a lot of it comes down to this rate of return and what are we getting out for what we're paying in. And the sad reality is that every dollar that you put into the system and that I have, it's not sitting there waiting for us in our retirement. It is all gone out the door to current and previous retirees. And already on an annual basis, Social Security is sending out more money in benefit checks than it's taking in payroll taxes. So our rate of return, if we were just to think about those dollars over time, it's zero. It's actually negative because it's never having the chance to earn a positive return. And the only way that we get anything out of Social Security is by future Congress's commitment to taxing younger generations to pay for the benefits that they've promised. We actually have no right to those future promises, and the Supreme Court has ruled that Congress can take them away at any point. We know that the system is broken. It will be insolvent in 2035 and unable to pay those benefits. And that's where I go back to the question of the rate of return, and is it worth it to have this big Social Security program that people count on as their primary source of income in retirement? And at the end of the day, no, it's not.
Yeah, and Al Gore once told us about this lockbox in Washington, D.C. with all the Social Security money just sitting there. And you would think that the government would be smart enough to get some rate of return and invest that money. How come it doesn't work like that?
It doesn't work like that because as soon as we established the system, we started paying benefits out shortly thereafter. And so it's kind of always been this pay-as-you-go system. And we just counted on populations continuing to rise at the rate they did and people continuing to die at the younger years that they used to. And they don't anymore. And now that things have changed, people are living longer, our fertility rates are lower. It's not working. We can't finance the system going forward. And so starting when this notional trust fund, which doesn't actually even exist, but when this accounting mechanism runs out of money in 2035, then we're only going to have enough of incoming tax revenues to pay about 75% of the benefits. So that's going to affect you and I for sure. And it will even affect some of the people who are retired today that will still be alive then and receiving benefits. Instead of, say, it's $2,000 a month, you're going to immediately start getting $1,500 a month if Congress doesn't do anything. And so the question becomes, what should they do then? And recognizing that Social Security is a very poor deal for people, the argument should be we need to get the program smaller and not bigger. We need to get it back to its original purpose, which was a social safety net. We don't need to be financing the retirement of millionaires. We need to be making sure that people don't live in poverty when they're too old to work.
Yeah. So Social Security, was there ever a time when the system worked like it maybe should, like a real retirement system, or is it kind of fatally flawed from the start? And I've heard a lot of good people on the right say things like, oh, it was okay until insert president name, LBJ is one popular name, but could be Clinton, could be another president that started raiding the Social Security trust funds. Or, my estimation is that it was kind of set up as a Ponzi scheme from the get-go. Am I wrong in that regard, or was there some fatal change that was made after the program was already moving forward?
No, you're correct in that regard, and changes have been made that have exacerbated the problem significantly. But the problem was always there because you paid benefits to people who did not pay into the system long enough to earn them, and so we started out kind of in the hole from the beginning. And the money has never actually been, sitting there invested. The only thing that the Social Security surpluses, when we did have more money coming in than coming out, the only thing they ever went into was U.S. Treasuries to finance the government spending more money on all sorts of other things that weren't Social Security. So the best possible rate of return that we've ever gotten is the rate of a U.S. Treasury, about 2 to 3% these days. But looking at what could you have gotten instead in the private investments, even if it's a conservative investment portfolio, it's significantly more. And a colleague of mine at the Heritage Foundation did an analysis to say, what if we'd always put our money into our own personal savings instead of Social Security? And across the board, even the lowest income earner would be magnitudes better in retirement, and they'd also own that money. Not only would they be getting a lot more every month, but they would have a nest egg sitting there so that, say, they die when they're 68, they have a significant amount that they can leave to their heirs. This is particularly relevant for lower income individuals and communities where that could serve as something that would provide a home purchase or sending a grandchild to college, something that will really actually give them upward mobility over time. But as I said, across the board, we found huge benefits to be had from having your own money instead of giving it to the government. And just the average worker would be receiving 3 times as much per month from their own personal savings as they're getting from Social Security. So we really need to pare back Social Security to limit it to being just an anti-poverty program and protecting people who really don't have any money of their own. And then in so doing, free up individuals' hard-earned tax dollars so that they can have money that's their own, that they can choose how to save and what to spend it on.
Yeah, and I'll be sure to include a link to an article that you wrote on June the 18th of this year. It's titled "Why a Bigger Social Security Program Would Make Us Worse Off," and you have a really nice infographic there showing how different people at different earnings would improve their return. Now, I'm not familiar, partially because I do state policy on a day-to-day basis. The Social Security 2100 Act, that's a negative bill that's going to negatively impact, or expand Social Security in its current form. But are there efforts in Congress, or have there been? I know Trump's not a big entitlement reform kind of guy, but talk about, I guess, the state of Social Security reform. It seemed like we were close to getting some reforms both under Bill Clinton and George W. Bush, and that whole effort has fallen by the wayside. I know I'm asking a ton of questions here, but given the performance of the stock market under President Trump, one might expect that the tweeter-in-chief would be out there touting that as a potential, hey, look what you're missing out on because Social Security's rate of return is just so poor. Like, it's one thing for somebody in the depths of the economic downturn of a decade ago to say, well, private accounts are a terrible idea. That's a different story than certainly right now. I mean, overall, the rate of return is much better. So I'm sorry, that's like 5 questions in one, but you can work your way through whatever sections you'd like.
Yeah, thank you. I'll try to tackle that. Yes, going back to recent administrations that have tried to address Social Security, the Bush administration had a big push for private accounts, and as you mentioned, it didn't help that the stock market tanked shortly after that, and I think that's what really cut the wind out of that effort, is people having fear over if that money had been invested and they had lost it all. That's not what it would look like in, personal savings that were life cycle accounts. But nonetheless, I think that was part of the reason behind that effort dying. The Obama administration didn't want to touch Social Security. The Trump administration doesn't want to touch Social Security. And this gets to the nature of the program providing benefits to so many people and providing such a significant portion of their income that there's a fear over ever cutting anything back from it, that people just would not be able to survive without these benefits. 1 out of every 5 Americans receives a Social Security check today. And so it's become incredibly popular, and part of that is because the workers receiving the benefits today didn't actually pay into the system the full taxes that you and I are paying. And it's also half hidden because the employer is paying half of the taxes. And so I think people don't realize that they're actually getting a bad deal out of it. To them, the taxes were hidden, and all they're receiving is this great benefit check. And so it's just really difficult for politicians to step out there and say, look, I want to address these shortfalls, and here's how I want to do it, because you've got to raise taxes or you've got to cut benefits. There is one proposal out there called the Social Security 2100 Act that you mentioned, and the House of Representatives held a hearing on this particular bill last week, and it's likely that they will vote on the measure this fall and that it will pass with at least all of the Democrats' support. And so what does that do, and what would our Social Security taxes and benefits look like if this bill gets passed? Well, it would raise the current Social Security tax from 12.4% to 14.8%. So an average worker who makes $50,000 a year, that's going to be an extra $1,200 in taxes taken out of your paychecks every single year. That's really significant. The total Social Security tax bill, including what you already pay, would be $7,400 per year, and that's what an average household, multiple people, spend on food in a given year. So this would become one of your biggest expenses, and then we get talking about, well, is it worth it? And we did an analysis to say, well, what if you took those taxes and instead of putting them into Social Security, you had them in your own savings? And we find out again across the board, the additional savings that you would have instead of the higher benefits that the Act promises, you'd have far more in savings, and that would be money that you owned and controlled and could do what you wanted with, including leaving it to heirs. And so lower middle income, high income, everybody would be better off under this. And so that begs the question, why are we trying to make the program bigger? Under this proposal that would make it solvent by raising the taxes, everybody gets a benefit increase. It's not just saying those of you who are at the bottom, who have the lowest benefits, we're going to bring you up. Under this Social Security 2100 Act, the average millionaire would get an additional $12,333 per year in Social Security benefits, while somebody who makes $30,000 a year would get an extra $333. It just doesn't make sense to be expanding a program, raising taxes on everybody, giving everybody higher benefits for a social safety net program when people would be far better off keeping more of their paychecks and having the government just be there as that backstop for people who really need it.
No doubt about it. Well, certainly, as I said earlier, I would love to be able to invest my own money in my own Social Security money into a system that actually generates a rate of return. And even if you factor in, I've seen analyses dating back to a decade ago when the stock market did see a significant drop. Even if you did invest your money in a very responsible, diversified way, even during bad economic times, but you did it for a few decades, chances are you do very, very well, and certainly much better than what we're seeing under Social Security. So expanding that system is just nonsense. It's crazy talk. But this is Washington nowadays. Rachel, and we got a few minutes left, but pensions, both public employee and there are a few privately held or publicly traded corporations out there still with traditional defined benefit pension programs. Something happened in Washington on that. Unfortunately, it wasn't good recently, and pension reform is kind of analogous to the Social Security issue. So why don't you talk briefly about that issue and how pensions are really maybe not the best solution for retirement for workers in the 21st century?
Yes, I'd love to. Pensions are not always a popular thing to talk about because I think a lot of people think they've gone by the wayside and they're not relevant anymore. And actually, I wrote a piece a while back saying defined benefit pensions, not your grandfather's pension, because we have this notion that this pension is this wonderful thing. It's a secure, promised benefit that's always going to be there when you retire. And the reality is that a lot of employers and a lot of state and local governments across the U.S. have used pensions as a way to make promises to their workers. It's a form of their compensation, pretty similar to wages. And so they've made these promises, but yet it was a great way for them to promise them higher compensation, not actually have to pay for it, because they said, well, if we get 8% returns in the stock market, then we only need to set aside a couple $100 to pay you this big benefit in retirement. Well, it turns out that they have not managed their pensions well. They haven't set aside enough money to pay them. And this is a big problem, particularly among private union pension plans. They have something called multi-employer pensions. And both those plans and state and local plans are pretty much free to make their own assumptions and to run these plans as they want. There are rules that apply to single employer plans, but not to these union run ones. And so Congress last week passed a bill called the Rehabilitation for Multi-Employer Pensions Act. In just a couple sentences, what this does is it effectively opens up $638 billion of taxpayer money to bail out the unfunded promises that these unions and employers have made to their workers across about 1,400 plans covering about 10 million workers in the U.S. And the problem with this bill is that it gives these bailouts both through loans and through direct taxpayer cash, but then it does nothing to fix the problem going forward. It actually incentivizes the employers and unions who have these plans to keep underfunding them and to keep making more promises that they're not going to be able to keep, because now the door is open to taxpayer money to cover those promises. And so it's a really problematic precedent that's been set here, and not only is $638 billion an enormous amount of underfunded pensions for these 1,400 private union plans, But that opens the door to all the state and local plans across the U.S. where there are far more workers, and there's nearly 10 times the level of unfunded promises, anywhere between $4 and $6 trillion. And I think it will be hard for Congress, if the Senate takes up this measure and passes it, to say to workers, well, we bailed out these private sector pension plans, but we're not going to cover those of these hardworking teachers and firefighters and the state and local governments across the U.S. But if you do cover them, you're talking about massive amounts of money that everybody else that's paying taxes in the U.S. is going to have to fork over to reward reckless behavior and to penalize, the state and local governments that have done the right thing and have actually funded their plans. So it's a really big problem if Congress does do this thing where never before in history have they intervened and bailed out private sector plans, but it could set a terrible precedent going forward.
Okay, so the good news is it only passed the House, right? And
it only passed the House, but unfortunately with 29 Republicans signing on, that was not a good sign.
Oh, boy. Yeah.
And then the
what's
same
the
day,
bill
the
number
Senate,
on that?
It's H.R. 397. A similar measure was then reintroduced the same day in the Senate called the Butch-Lewis Act. And so we will see if they will take that up. I don't think that the Senate will take it up within the next year or so, but certainly if it changed hands, we could see that being passed in a future Congress.
Yeah, because, ultimately private sector pensions are one thing, but at some point, I think we all agree that government employee pensions at the state level are unsustainable, and there's going to be a reckoning where some state is going to come hand in hand to Washington, D.C., which is bankrupt in its own way, but asking for a bailout for the state. And that's never happened, but this is a kind of a step in that direction, right?
Exactly. And we even had a previous Illinois Governor Quinn, who included it in his budget proposal, was federal backing of their pensions. So it's already been put on the table.
Wonderful. Well, Rachel, anything else you want to say before I let you go? I know we'll give out your particulars in terms of your organization, et cetera, but any last thoughts or comments?
I don't think so.
All right. Thank you for coming on Tipping Point, New Mexico today. Again, Rachel is at the Heritage Foundation. Any way specifically people can find your work, because Heritage has so many great scholars and great information is available on their website. It might be a little tough to find your area particularly, but what should they look for if they go to the heritage.org website?
Yep, just on heritage.org. If you put in my last name, Greszler, all of the research that I've done will come up there. And the Daily Signal is also another media outlet of the Heritage Foundation that has some great articles.
Great, and it's Greszler. And
correct.
Thanks for your time today, Rachel. Such an important topic, Social Security, as somebody who recognizes that we're getting just a terrible rate of return on that. It really is frustrating. And also the minimum wage issue, to even be contemplating $15 an hour is it's just nuts. And I'll say one thing, here in New Mexico, being a low wage state, at least one of our Democrats in Congress did vote against it, but the other two voted for it, and it just shows how far out of touch these people are with the realities of New Mexico's economy and kind of the low wage points that this state really is dealing with. But thanks for your time, and folks, go check out Rachel's work at the Heritage Foundation and very important issues. We'll deal with all these issues someday, hopefully while we still have time to actually pay the bills on these entitlements and whatnot. Thanks for listening to this week's podcast. Make sure to get the latest edition of Tipping Point, New Mexico by subscribing at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. You can post or comment on this and other episodes on Facebook and Twitter, and tell Google Home, play Tipping Point, New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.